afternoon and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for High Capacity Transit in the Treasure Valley. What would it take? Today we're with Bob Post, Vice President of AECOM. I'm Amy Luft, the Communication Coordinator at Compass. Compass strives to reach out to all residents of Ada and Canyon counties. Please help us track how well we are doing by participating in the poll on your screen. Responses are anonymous and the participation is completely voluntary. We appreciate your help. Could a high-capacity transit system parallel to I-84 work in the Treasure Valley? Where would it go? What would it look like? What even is high capacity anyway? Compass is exploring what it would take to provide high-capacity transit service from Caldwell to Nampa, Meridian, and Boise. While a service such as this, if the Valley wants it, is still 20 or more years away, the time to plan for it is now. Today, Bob Post will share the results of a recently completed study on high-capacity transit service, focusing on how different types of transit and different routes could meet regional goals. In his presentation, Bob will share study results, recommendations, and next steps, and answer your questions about future high-capacity transit. I have posted a link to the study Bob will be discussing in the chat. You can also find it on Compass's homepage at compassidaho.org. Bob Post has over 50 years' experience in the transportation industry. As Vice President of AECOM, Bob has served as a leader in the firm's transit practice, leading a wide range of transit planning and design projects. Bob has led the study and implementation of a full range of transit alternatives, including bus rapid transit, light rail, streetcar, and commuter rail projects. A few quick housekeeping items before we start. We have a record number of people joining us today, so for good sound quality, all participants have been muted. As you have questions, please type them in the chat box, and Mr. Post will answer the questions at the end of his remarks. The presentation is being recorded and will be available later on Compass's YouTube channel. Watch for emails on the Compass website for information on future presentations as well. Again, a reminder to please complete the poll to help us make sure we are reaching out to all residents of Ada and Canyon counties. And with that, Bob, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Amy. Really appreciate the introduction and welcome everybody. It's great to see so many people interested in the transportation future of the Treasure Valley. This is just update of a study. Next slide, please. And I've got a poll in the middle of my screen, excuse me. This is really an update of a study that was initially undertaken in 2009, looking at high capacity transit in the Treasure Valley area. And this study was to take a look at that previous study, update the study, and look at the range of alternatives and confirm whether they still are a range that makes sense in today's environment. It's also to identify the changes that have occurred, and there have been a lot of them in the Treasure Valley. In addition to the projected high level of increase in both population and employment, there's also, as all of you can probably appreciate, an impact on the transportation system in terms of travel time and level of congestion. So those are items that were addressed during this brief update. Next. Before we go on, let's just step back a little bit. And what do we mean by high capacity transit? And generally, as a kind of a loose definition, it's talking about transit that's faster than a local bus. That's in part because it stops less frequently and has stops further apart. Generally, it carries more people because you funnel service into it and take advantage of the capacity of these kind of systems. And also, they generally come with a special branding and improved services, improved dependability, and improved amenities in terms of the station stops. I want to just also make an additional comment. I realized when I went back through these slides that it looks in some fashion like like local bus is not an important component, and I don't want to at all convey that that's a message. The local bus system on any community that that brings in high capacity transit into their mix of transit services and transportation services will always depend on a local bus system that's vibrant and effective in moving trips in and around the region. So I just wanted to make that clear before we moved ahead. It's not anticipation that the local bus service goes away or is not an important component. Next. Just to orient everybody, the study focused on the Treasure Valley area, loosely defined for the purposes of this study of extending from downtown Boise west to Caldwell. And so that's the area study, and these are the kind of the study zones that information such as population employment was gathered into. Next. I want to introduce you to the 4 basic alternatives that are being considered and were considered as part of this study. And the first one is called bus rapid transit. And we further define that as in mixed traffic. So it's an alternative that has buses for the most part operating mixed traffic except at major points of congestion where there may be specialized treatments in terms of the signal system or in terms of lane allocation in order to allow the buses to get through those areas quicker. The stops would be less frequent than the typical 3 to 4, 2, 3, or 4 block spacing that you see of the local bus service. So maybe in the range of a half mile to 2/3 of a mile would be typical for these kind of projects. Generally, try to brand the system in terms of the signage, the buses, the stops, and upgrade the stops and the shelters and for these types of application. Of the alternatives we're looking at, this is the least capital intensive in terms of cost. Next, we have a second category that we've looked at in terms of bus rapid transit. And this is a bus rapid transit exclusive, which, as the name implies, that a good portion, if not all of the alignment, would have the buses running in a segregated exclusive kind of operation. So on the left side, you see lanes that are totally dedicated to the bus. That's from Eugene, Oregon. The 2 photos on the right are from the LA area, where a portion of the particular line shown here is the orange line, runs in an abandoned rail right away. Other portions, as shown here, runs in a lane dedicated to transit, but only striped with rumble strips in between the general traffic. This would have wider station spacing, so maybe on a half mile to mile spacing. The stations, as I mentioned, for the other BRT alternative is kind of upgraded in terms of the amenities, and often the buses used for these types of systems would be larger buses. Articulated coaches would be fairly common. The cost would be higher because you are creating a dedicated right-of-way. Next is, next slide. Next slide is light rail systems. You probably may be familiar with that, in that there's a number of systems in the Northwest using light rail, electrically powered, generally operate in exclusive right-of-way because they go at higher speeds, and they provide a more reliable service because it is segregated from general traffic. Stations are more robust and on average may be somewhere in the half to 1 mile station spacing. Usually the crossing of streets, unless it's at a station location, and even then most times would require protection, either gated protection or use of the street signal system if it's at a street crossing. These systems can also, in order to add capacity, can be have multiple units. In other words, besides being able to operate as a single vehicle, it could operate connected as 2 or 3 or more vehicles to address capacity over time. And as you can imagine, because it's exclusive and it has its own right-of-way and it's segregated from other traffic, this is a higher cost alternative compared to the others. Next. The last category is commuter rail, and commuter rails has higher speeds. Generally, station spacing is much more. Ranges in 3 to 5 miles between stops. Many of these systems have been implemented using freight rail right-of-way that's either been abandoned for freight use or is lightly used as for freight operations. Station spacing, as I mentioned, is much wider. It uses a range of technologies. It could be either diesel or electric. Those are the 2 most common. Okay, next. What I just went through was the 4 alternatives, and just wanted to kind of show how they relate to each other in terms of the speed of operation, which is shown as higher speeds, the alternatives that are shown higher in this graph, and then whether they serve a regional or local level. And certainly commuter rail, light rail are often seen as higher speed operations because they're usually segregated from general traffic. Bus rapid transit kind of covers the whole gamut. It can be in mixed traffic. It can be in segregated traffic, as we discussed before. And then we're showing other services such as local service and some other special regional services. But this kind of shows the relationship and whether they're more of a regional nature. Generally, commuter rail projects are in the range of 15 to 50 miles in length. So they're longer corridors. Light rail generally from 5 to 20 miles, and then rapid bus can be pretty much anything. So it can cover the full range of treatments. But this kind of shows you the relationship between the alternatives that are being looked at in this particular study. Next. The 2009 study that I mentioned earlier looked at 8 corridors, and it had a series of evaluations in terms of how well it served the major activity centers, the major employment centers, and the downtown areas of Boise, Meridian, Napa, and Caldwell. And as a result of that study, the number of alternatives was reduced down to 4, and it's the 4 that are shown here: Fairview, Franklin. In yellow is showing the Boise cutoff rail corridor, and then I-84, I-184. And so those are the general corridors that were looked at in this particular study. We reviewed the previous process and saw no reason that others come back because they did not meet some of the criteria with respect to the activity centers and the downtown centers that are being served. So these are the 4 alignments that are looked at. Next slide. Okay, just as a review, these are the alternatives that were looked at in this study and went through an evaluation process. For Fairview and Franklin, they both had the same range of alternatives. We looked at BRT and mixed traffic, BRT exclusive, and then light rail in each of those 2 corridors. For the Boise cutoff, a little different mix. It's BRT exclusive, a light rail and the commuter rail, in part because there wouldn't be a mixed traffic operation within the Boise cutoff, particularly if it would be retained in railroad ownership. And then the I-84, 184, we looked at the BRT, both mixed traffic and exclusive. So that's the range of alternatives that were kind of carried through this study and evaluated. Next slide. What we did was evaluate against a series of goals that were reviewed and adopted. And I want to mention that under each goal, there was a series of objectives, either 2 to 4 objectives. And we'll come back to that a little bit and illustrate some of the objectives that we did evaluate projects against. But the goal sets were to, first of all, goal 1 is improve transit connectivity. How well does transit connect to major employment and residential areas, and also downtown environments. Goal 2 is improve transit mobility. A lot of that was related to how well the alternative operated within the whole range of other transit and highway improvements. Goal 3 was manage travel demand, and a lot of that was related to the ridership element. We looked at transit supportive transportation and land use plans. How well does it support current plans and current planning and projected year 2040, 2050 plans. And then finally, looking briefly at financial feasibility. At this high level of study, a lot of that was just looking at what would it cost to build these different systems and what would it cost to operate the systems. Next, I'm going to go through just a very few of the evaluations we undertook. And the first one was travel time, which is an important component whenever you're looking at transit. How does it function and does it provide, from a time standpoint, a competitive trip? Now you have to look at this a little different because this is travel time, so less is better. So the shorter the line, the better. And as you could anticipate, operating on the 2 arterials, Franklin and Fairview, would not be as quick. You have a lot of cross streets, you have existing traffic, and so not unexpectedly, the travel times on those facilities for all the alternatives was a bit longer. Most competitive in travel time was shown at the bottom here in the Boise cutoff, and the commuter rail option was very competitive time-wise, and obviously with wider station spacing and faster vehicle operations. That's the reason for that. But some other alternatives were pretty competitive. Light rail in the Boise cutoff, and then the BRT exclusive and I-84 and in the Boise cutoff were also fairly competitive. So it's obviously at this high level, there's a lot of refinement to be done, but I think this provides at least an initial kind of feeling for, it gives you a feeling for the how the alternatives perform in terms of travel time. And I would expect, even though the specifics of the travel times will change as the projects would get more defined, I suspect the relationships between them would be somewhat the same. Let's go to the next slide. Travel demand, which is the ridership, and this is a 2035 based on the projections that were done 2009, and I'll explain that a little bit. Obviously, there is a desire to update those to year 2040 and base them on current population employment, but that information from the census wasn't available during the time this study is being done, and so that's a task that's still out there. So, however, I would not expect the relationship between the alternatives would change significantly. I would expect the ridership numbers to be higher because I think the population employment in the Treasure Valley has increased substantially. So we'd expect the numbers to be higher, but the relationships maybe would say somewhat the same. And once again, as you model ridership, one of the factors that plays in a positive, from a positive standpoint, is travel time. And so I mentioned before that the Boise cutoff alternatives fared pretty well from a travel standpoint. And so you see that also reflected in the ridership numbers. And so they performed well. And then the BRT exclusive shown on I-84 also performed well. So this once again gives you kind of the relationship and the relative value of the alternatives from a ridership standpoint, and help give you some sense of how they perform in terms of ridership. Next slide. This slide is only about capital cost and kind of the order of magnitude capital costs. Obviously, at this point in time, there's been no design done on these alternatives. So, but these are based on kind of industry experiences with projects of a similar nature for each one of the different projects. So what you see is across the board that light rail, and it's understandable, light rail creates a whole, to be a separated operation, regardless of where it's at, requires, you know, that it's segregated, it has its own right of way, and so it comes out consistently as a more expensive alternative. The alternatives that obviously fared well, as you can imagine, would be the BRT mixed traffic, because for a good portion of their alignment, they're running in mixed traffic, so no change there. And then, and so a lot of these costs are reflected in terms of vehicle costs, and then specific signalization, and then new stations, maybe new buses. And then the other one that competed well from the capital cost standpoint was the commuter rail on the Boise cutoff alternative. Once again, takes advantage of existing right-of-way. It does require upgrading of trackage and signal systems, and so, but it still ends up being a fairly competitive in terms of cost. What we, next slide. What we did from this, and once again, a reflection that this is a pretty high level, that's not based on a design level assessment of these alternatives. And so we decided, rather than providing some numerical evaluation of the alternatives, that we would provide a visual representation of how well each one of the alternatives, which are listed across the top, the Boise cutoff, commuter rail, light rail, BRT exclusive, as an example, how well they performed against 14 different objectives that we'd set out underneath the 5 goals that we'd established. And so with solid blue being the kind of being judged as being most compatible with the particular objective, and a solid green kind of being in the middle, and the golden color being indicating least competitive with respect, or compatible with respect to that particular objective. And so this, it just in a simplified manner, tries to give some impression of what's how the alternatives stacked up. And what you can see is that some across the board in terms of service to central business districts, the very first line across there, all the alternatives performed well, and the only reason commuter rail doesn't is that it's harder to provide a commuter rail if it ends up on the at the Boise Depot up on the hill. Then you still have to get passengers downtown, so there's not as direct service. But what you kind of glancing through this, you see in the Boise cutoff, the commuter rail and BRT exclusive performed pretty well, and that on the other, Fairview and Franklin, that the BRT mixed traffic performed pretty well in meeting those various objectives. Down towards the bottom on the LRT alternatives, once again, those that are colored as least compatible is really a function of the high cost of the light rail. And in some ways, the alternatives on I-84, I think in general perform well, but there is a difficulty of how you access alternatives that are either operating on the freeway itself or have stations on the exit and entrance ramps. And so less able to have a good connection with local service and with pedestrian bike service. And so those were marked down somewhat in those areas. So that's provides just a visual representation of how the alternatives fared. Obviously, in moving forward and looking at the alternatives, get into much more detail, and these become then hard numbers in terms of cost, in terms of cost effectiveness, in terms of other categories that can be measured that way. Next slide. We were asked to make some observation recommendations and kind of suggested next steps. So go to the next slide. And so here's what we took a look at in terms of the short-term next steps and what recommendations. First of all, it's always helpful because it's key to investing in high-capacity transit is what's the ridership. And as I mentioned before, the data from the 2020 census is not available, broken down in a level that can be used for ridership projections at the time we were doing this study. So that's a piece of work that needs to be done, and a piece of information that will be valuable in taking a look at these alternatives. We also suggested that it's likely any of these alternatives could potentially qualify for federal funding, which I think it would be wise to pursue. Typically these days it could pick up to half the cost of a project, and that is some rumor that may go, that level of federal participation could potentially go up. And so the recommendation was it's time to start having a discussion just with the federal government. And that, what I need to say is that's already happened, that the Compass staff has had discussions with the Fed just to find out what their perspective is and how they will interface with the process as it would move ahead in looking at alternatives. The other thing is, as you look at what's the next step and when do you initiate the next step in looking at these alternatives, narrowing them and coming to a conclusion of what alternatives you want to pursue seriously and which one would be your preferred alternatives, is when do you start that process? And a lot of regions have developed thresholds with triggers. It can be congestion levels, it can be travel time. And you very well may decide we're already there. We already have problems, and so we need to move on. But it's helpful to have those in place. We suggested, and it's kind of a, maybe not fairly, but it's kind of called the poor man's way to get into looking at different high capacity transit alternatives, is maybe take a look at BRT in mixed traffic as maybe a bus on shoulders. And it's basically a number of jurisdictions around the US, in order to implement a more dependable service, have looked at major highways and freeway facilities to see if it's possible during peak hours to use the shoulder as a busway. And Vancouver, Washington, working with the Washington State Department of Transportation, has already initiated this on SR 14 in the Vancouver, Washington area, and are under construction for the same thing on a section of I-5. And then they're also looking at same thing in the Seattle area, and there's a number of regions around the US of looking at it. May not be a solution for physical reasons or other reasons, but it's probably something worth adding to the mix. The other is consider maybe a phased implementation of alternatives. If the initial cost is beyond what can be reasonably funded, maybe you look at an initial segment, and many times the federal government, the Federal Transit Administration, will ask that you do this in a longer corridor. And then it's, as you begin thinking about high capacity transit moving forward, it's probably time to start at least thinking about funding sources. You don't need to have those firmed up during what's normally the next phase, which is called alternatives analysis, but you need to begin having some ideas how you'd fund different options. Next, kind of an intermediate term, we suggested that they really need to move towards reducing the range of high capacity alternatives. We have today discussed with you 11 combinations of alignment and mode alternatives. That's quite a lot to be taking into kind of a more detailed phase, because it starts getting expensive as you take the alternatives to a kind of a conceptual level of design and get into a lot more details on each one of them. And so I may want to look at a way to reduce the range of alternatives. Also look at what additional information would be needed to begin informing a decision. And one thing that I would mention that will come up as you advance is, how do you take into consideration some of the movements that are going on in terms of the broader transportation arena? How does autonomous vehicles impact the thinking about making investments in high capacity transit, and how would that change the dynamics of mobility within your region? Something to think about and discuss. Understand the experience of other regions. You are in a unique situation in Boise in that you have a number of jurisdictions that surround you that have been through this same process. And those would be Salt Lake City, Eugene, Oregon, Portland region, Vancouver, Washington, and Seattle, Tacoma area, and Spokane have all been through these processes. And take advantage of that. Have those discussions with those others. What would they do differently? What did they think they did right? What were the considerations, and how those changed their thinking about the alternatives? And then last recommendation is really part of what's happening today is need to initiate and continue to have a robust community discussion about these alternatives, because they are important to how the region will function and how it will grow. And last slide. Last slide was just a conclusion of this study. Was we came in with 4 different alignments. There was nothing in our evaluation that suggested that those 4 should not continue forward. So with that, I'm going to stop talking and turn it back to Amy, who is going to moderate the Q&A session.
Great, thank you, Bob. We had several questions generally dealing with location. If you want Jonathan to go back to the slide that showed the region, it was just the second or third slide. Several general locations asking about why Southeast Boise was not included in there. One more back, I think. Keep going. Oh, and still keep going. Sorry.
It's
There.
slide.
Yes. Some questions about Southeast Boise, the Micron facility in Southeast Boise, the airport, why those weren't part of the broader study area, and then also a question about Star and Eagle north of the Boise River, which I'll ask you to respond first, Bob, but then I may ask Rachel Haukala to jump in a little bit because she can talk a little bit more as well about State Street and the Boise Star Eagle area.
I think, I wasn't around when the original corridor was defined, but I think the corridor that you see defined as broadly as the Treasure Valley corridor was focused on simply because the dramatic growth in that area. That doesn't mean that other major attraction, such as the airport, Micron, and others, don't warrant a similar consideration. But this is unique in terms of the magnitude of the growth, but also the corridor, which is linear, which lays itself out well to kind of high capacity, which are generally described as longer, whereas the access to the airport and Micron and some of the others in the southeast would be shorter and kind of lend themselves more to just a specific focus just on those categories. That's I don't know if that's a good explanation, but I think that is, this was an area that was focused on simply because it met the definition that you'd normally think of in terms of a corridor that is kind of well shaped and defined for high capacity transit.
Thanks, Bob. I'm also going to bring in Rachel Haukala. She is the Compass planner who focuses on public transportation, and she might be able to provide a little more detail, as well as talk a little bit about the question about Star and Eagle and how those would fit in. Rachel, you are a co-host, so you should be able to unmute yourself if you want to jump in.
Yes, thank you, Amy. And I would agree with what Bob said about the original corridor being where we were seeing most of the growth, and especially along the interstate. So looking at a high capacity transit to help alleviate some of that, as we're expecting to just continue to see that growth into the future. And then as far as Eagle and Star, Valley Regional Transit is working on a State Street bus rapid transit project already, which will probably come before this, and that's looking along State Street from downtown Boise out to Eagle and possibly beyond. So that is in progress already for that corridor.
Thank you, Rachel. Next question has to do with goals. The question was, why wasn't a goal to reduce traffic on highways and streets, as well as goals related to emissions and pollution?
I think that's captured in the overall goal area of mobility, in terms of that's not just how you add additional service, but it should come in the context of how do you address the overall movement of people and goods within a geographic area. And so, you know, I would, well, although it wasn't part specifically of this study of all high capacity alternatives in the corridor, certainly as the ability to fund these kind of improvements, and also highway improvements, which in order to add a lot of capacity in this corridor would be also extremely expensive. What do you do to, you know, to moderate the amount of demand and change that dynamic? And maybe, don't wish this on anybody, but we probably learned a lot from the pandemic in terms of, I expect a lot about people being able to do a lot of work remotely. And I suspect that some of those trips that are not being made today will continue to be not made. And so there may be a different dynamic out there, and it'll be hard to gauge that for a while. But yes, part of the overall discussion about making these kind of investments is also what are you going to do to address the level of demand and what in terms of both the highway system and the transit system, and so that should be part of the equation. But once again, this was specifically to identify the transit element of an overall program.
Thank you, Bob.
Yeah.
Next question is about the graph showing the relative travel times. And it asks, how were the travel times determined? Specifically, if bus rapid transit had priority in traffic, why is it slower on routes with more crossroads?
Just because you still have, I'll take Eagle Road that crosses and pick one, Franklin or Fairview, and you got these major arterials. You, to some degree, you can do things that I mentioned to get you through those areas faster, but you still have to deal with the cross section and it still will require more time, particularly on either end of the corridor. You notice that each one of these alternatives are defined by kind of the center of the corridor, and then you've got the access into downtown Boise, and you've got getting through into Napa and onto Caldwell. And so each one of these has their own set of unique circumstances. But and one of the things you look at when you get in more detail is how much preference you're going to be able to give each one of these alternatives in terms of signal timing and stuff. And it's got to be there's always some balancing there. And so what this took into account is that you're operating on if you're operating a BRT exclusive, the orange line on I-84, that's a whole different animal than doing it on Franklin Boulevard, where you still typically would not be having their vehicles go much faster than the posted speed limit, even if they have a dedicated lane. Goes somewhat faster, but it's not like a freeway. So they do have the cross streets. They do have more numerous stops.
Next question is about light rail.
I want to say that's a good question,
oh,
and part of that becomes, when you get into the details of how the signals are going to work, and also the frequency of stops and stuff, you can see these lines change. Excuse me. Sorry.
Oh, no, excuse me. Next question is about light rail and why light rail was not looked at along Interstate 84, that some other places around the country have used their interstates as essentially a corridor for light rail.
Yeah, we took a look at that, and a lot of it has to do with access. And with the bus alternatives, you have some things you can play with. You can maybe have the stops, the buses come up the ramps and stop, and you get access to the local bus service and get access to maybe a park and ride. That probably not a reasonable, from a cost standpoint and many other aspects, to do that with light rail. That light rail would probably stay at freeway level, which means it's very, very difficult to get access, pedestrian, bicycle access, other access. A lot of it has to be vertical to get up to the cross street, but even then you got a fair distance before you could get to a park and ride or adjacent development. Part of these systems, if you're going to invest in them, you want to invest it in a way that you can take advantage of them with adjacent development. And if you're in a freeway right away, it's hard, your ability to be close to development, close to other activities is pretty limited. So it was a judgment call. We didn't, and that was consistent with the call that was made in the 2009 study, is that that would be a very difficult and probably not as effective operation. But it is good observation. In some areas it works. I was project manager on the first light rail line in Portland, and we run adjacent to I-84 in the downtown section of the line. And fortunately, in that section, the freeway is depressed, and so the access was a lot more simpler to get to the stations on that system. But anyhow, it was a judgment call that was influenced a lot by the ability to access the line if it's at the freeway level.
A similar question, was there an analysis of a dedicated bus rapid transit lane or lanes along the Boise Rail corridor in that right-of-way?
That's the, yes, that's the BRT exclusive. That's one of the alternatives we did look at, which would be create a bus solution. If the railroad were still in operation, and that requires some form of a very positive barrier between the two. So in other words, there'd be some kind of concrete barrier and a distance that's required by Federal Railroad Administration. So, yeah, the answer is yes. We looked at that. That is under Boise cutoff. That's the orange line there, and we did look at that alternative, and it has some advantages. If the railroad were to no longer exist, but the right of way were available, that would make that alternative easier to do, because the difficulty when the railroad's still there is, one, the separation I mentioned, but also how you handle the numerous road crossings, and those will all have to be gated because they do not happen in the context of an intersection, a roadway intersection. So anyhow, the answer is for the Boise cutoff, we looked at BRT exclusive, BRT or LRT, and then the commuter rail. We did not look at the mixed traffic because we didn't think introducing traffic into that environment made sense, particularly with Franklin Boulevard being directly adjacent.
And just sticking with the same theme of broadly the different alignments that you looked at, question is, why was a dedicated right-of-way outside the Union Pacific Railroad tracks between Nampa and Caldwell, as noted in the other Compass study, not considered in this study?
That was a level of detail that we didn't get into much. We looked at using the street environment. It's very difficult to convince the railroad that anything ought to be on their line, and it's different on the cutoff because that's a low volume line as opposed to the Union Pacific line between Nampa and Caldwell, which is a Union Pacific main line. And from years of experience in working with railroads, that's probably having a bus, let alone a rail transit alternative within the right-of-way is a difficult thing. And so that doesn't mean that wouldn't be looked at in a more detailed study, but at this level, we said, there is an adjacent road, and can we find a way to make use for that? And so, excellent question, because it is a right-of-way. It's there, but it is a mainline right-of-way, which is a different situation than the Boise cutoff, which is not a main line. I don't know if I got that.
So changing.
Sorry.
So switching gears just a little bit, question about cost. Says it sounds like there's still a lot of steps to go before this could be a reality, but is there a ballpark figure as to how much this would cost overall?
Each one of the alternatives, we have what we call the order of magnitude. And as I mentioned, it's based on similar projects. So take the alternatives that are shown on here for the BRT mix, the purple line, the shorter one. That's based on 2 or 3 very recent projects, one of which is the Fourth Plane project in Vancouver, Vancouver, Washington, and be very similar to what could happen here in Boise in terms of just the character of the alignment. So we used their cost estimate brought up to current day dollars because it opened, I think, 3 or 4 years ago. And we took a look at a couple others. Same thing with commuter rail. We looked at similar systems. We didn't obviously look at the Seattle system because that's it's a much more robust system and it's totally segregated. And so we looked at operations that are more similar. Examples would be Salt Lake City areas, commuter rail, and the commuter rail in Portland would be similar in nature to this. So what we did was use those as comparables, brought the cost to current year cost, and made some adjustments if we thought there was some unique aspects that varied in Boise as opposed to these other projects. But there's a reason it's called order of magnitude, because all we got right now is a line on a map. We don't have any design. So these are based primarily on industry experience.
Question about ridership. It says, we've lived in metro areas that were building high capacity transit, and those systems were sold based on ridership estimates that turned out to be highly overestimated. How would Compass, or how would your study be able to look at riderships to ensure that those ridership estimates for the Treasure Valley are really accurate?
Well, one answer to that is that ridership estimating has got better over time, as one would expect, because you got better information. It's like doing any kind of projection. It's the quality of the input in terms of projected population employment, projected where that population employment is going to be, and how that relates to the particular alignment. So, station spacing is an impact, and whether or not, and travel times as a factor. So what I can say is, over time, the modeling has got better. The federal government, I can tell you, pays more attention to that than anything, and they are very much attuned and focused on riderships, and they don't take your word for it. They dig into it, and they have their own. And so they look at all the projects across the country. They know which ones have done well in the modeling and which ones have not. And so they take that into account. And in the final analysis, it's a projection, and you want to get it as close as possible. And the better your definition of the project is in terms of exactly where it is, where the stations are, and how well the connections are in terms of supporting transit service and in terms of bike ped access and auto access. All that goes into the kind of equations that are considerations for a project, and how well the ridership modeling does. I started in this business on real projects an awful long time ago, and I have to tell you that the ability to get the ridership projections close has improved a lot. Not to say there aren't hiccups once in a while, but and so you tend to want to bring in specialists to help local staffs and make sure that ridership projections are reasonable, and you can anticipate the federal government well, because they use that as a primary basis, making their decision whether they're going to give you money. So it's excellent question, because the history has not always been great in that area.
Thank you. A follow-up or kind of a finer point on the earlier question about costs. Just wondering if you can provide any more specificity on costs, even just a range of what like a low end might be versus a high end, or if the lines on the graph are, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars, just to give a sense of broadly what the region might be looking at.
Light rail, the options that we looked at based on comparable costs and comparable, and this would be a fairly lengthy light rail line, by the way, as an initial alignment going from downtown to all the way to Caldwell. That's fairly lengthy initial, but those costs are in the range of slightly over $2 billion. So if you want to, so you can kind of look at this range and say, well, these lower ones are in the range of 200 to 300 million. So does that help? They're big numbers when you look at some of the alternatives. But like I said, there's a number of things as you go through this process, you look at, and are there ways to cut the costs down? Yes. And one of the things I mentioned is, do you look at an initial segment that's shorter, and what does that do for you? But I have to say these are kind of based on similar projects, so I think they at least give you a ballpark sense. And like I said, for the light rail, it's a pretty big number.
So a couple of questions about the cost that it provides or cost that it is to provide services with the current development pattern with a lot of sprawl, and that high capacity transit could incentivize more sustainable development. Question is there has not been a comparative cost study to illustrate the cost of doing high capacity sooner. And perhaps this may be more of a question for Rachel at Compass, but Bob, you may be able to weigh in on this as well, is, you know, have those been done other places? What could it look like if this was done sooner, or is that even, given the planning time that it takes to do something like this, is that even a possibility?
Well, as a rule of thumb, you always get in trouble to use a rule of thumb, but from where you are today to having one of these projects up and running, obviously something like the BRT mixed traffic would take less time. But if you took the other alternatives, a general rule of thumb, you're talking about 10 years if you're going to use federal funds, because you've got to go through what they call now an alternatives now as a project development phase, and then approval to go into final design. You have final design, and then the construction period. And so you know, probably on average, that's around 10 years from the point you're at. Some will take longer if they're complicated. I can tell you, if say we just had somebody ask about the railroad and the outer end of the project, typically negotiations with the railroads are lengthy and take some time to get resolution, and that could impact the project timeline, because the federal government's not going to give you the money if they're not sure where the project's going to be and where it's going to go. But the other element is a lot of just the thought process of investing in high capacity transit is supporting of larger agendas, such as you know, future development, where you want that development to go and how well it can be served by a combination of transportation facilities, including transit, and how do you plan for that? The other thing is that a lot of these projects that are moving forward now, particularly if it's in the rail realm, commuter rail or light rail, is that the federal government is looking for commitments in terms of housing, particularly low low end or below market housing, and encouraging, and in fact giving jurisdictions money to find a way to make that happen. And so I'll just use an example here. The Portland region received somewhere, I think, in the range of $2.5 million. And this is a project that's in preliminary design, so 30% level of design to incorporate housing and below market housing into the actual design and consideration of park and ride lots, and whether you can provide housing over the top of them, and all kinds of schemes to address lower income housing. So it became kind of the project. Some of the money came from the Federal Transit Administration, some from other administrations, but a lot of these projects go hand in hand with land use and transit development objectives and planning.
So I actually have a very related follow-up question to that, but first it is 3 o'clock, which is our official cutoff time. Bob has agreed to stay on for an additional 30 minutes to answer any additional questions. But for those of you that do need to jump off, I wanted to say thank you for coming. Thank you, Bob. If you have not already, please do complete the survey on your screen that just asks some questions about your demographics to help us make sure we're reaching out to everyone the best we can. Also, Bob did allude to engaging with you. We do have a survey open on high capacity transit in the region, and I will place a link to the Compass homepage in your chat in just a moment, and that excuse me, and your responses to that will help us get a better understanding of what the public wants. Are people interested in high capacity transit at all? And if so, what types of service would best serve you? So for those of you that need to jump off, thank you very much for coming. Those of you that are able to stay on, Bob has agreed to stay on to answer some additional questions. And 1 second here. My chat has moved on me. There we go. So I just posted the link to the survey in the chat. We had a question here about transit-oriented development, and there we go. Was consideration how station design and transit-oriented development might improve bicycle and pedestrian and commercial area connectivity, particularly along the interstate and the cutoff alignment? So related to the response you were just giving there before we had our initial cutoff.
Yeah, when I started in this business, I don't remember giving much consideration to how people got to the line. You just built the line and they all come, right? That's not the case today. In fact, part of the evaluation of alternatives is what is the quality, or what would need to be done to improve the quality of pedestrian and bike access. And it's one of the considerations. Somebody did ask about light rail alternatives, and it was difficult to see how you would address that with a light rail alternative, which really needed to stay down at the freeway level, because you're segregated by on and off ramps at the locations where stations want to be. So, and even if you had one, it would be primarily have access from a pedestrian bike standpoint from only one side of the freeway. So the other side kind of cut off. So it's a critical component of any high capacity transit project these days, is that you need to take a look, and in many cases, jurisdictions, and not suggesting that's the case here, but I'll just tell you, I'm involved in a project in LA, and they are now requiring, as of the start of this project I'm on, of requiring that half-mile radius or half-mile of the rail corridor, that the project take a very specific look at what the pedestrian bike connections are and what improvements will need to be made, and specifically identified as part of the project improvements. And it's simply to make the project more accessible and more readily usable by the people that it's going by. So good question. But what I can say is that's, I have been involved in any projects recently where those aren't critical considerations, the bike ped access. And it's,
So I have a couple of questions. Oh,
it's important early in the plan process to engage those communities and get their input, and because a lot of times that can influence the location of stations, and it should.
so I have a couple of questions here that Rachel, I'm going to ask you to join Bob for, a couple that deal with the study, but as well as Compass's plans as they relate to that. And I'll kind of ask three at once, and then I can pause and I can state them each individually. But one asks just broadly about next steps from here after since we have this plan from Bob, what will Compass do from here moving forward? The next related asks about parking ride garages and how they are being considered in relationship to that, especially high capacity relationship to high capacity transit. And then a third asks about, beyond what we're talking about today, if we have looked at high capacity transit from Ontario all the way to Mountain Home. So Rachel, I'll ask you to jump on as well with Bob with those, and I'll let the two of you kind of tag team those, because I think some of those are going to deal more with Compass's planning in addition to what Bob is working on for us.
Yeah, I agree. Most of this is, but I will say that park and rides were considered, but it's a little early in the overall processes. Park and ride would be an important component of the projects, particularly the further you get from the downtown or in areas where the local bus service is not as robust, so you don't have it to connect in. Then you do want to look at park and ride. What you'll expect to see over time is that as the area fills in and there's more local service, is you ought to, as you plan park and rides, you ought to look and keep in mind the future when that could be converted to other uses. And a lot of that's going on as systems mature. Those park and ride lots become sites for TOD, transit-oriented development projects. So something to keep in mind. Good point. I didn't mention the park and rides, but they would be considered in conjunction to each one of these alignment options.
Thank you, Bob. I agree with that. And Compass also right now is finishing up a park and ride study, which looks at what the park and ride situation is currently in our region and what we need to do in the future to improve the system and how we should be expanding it. And the consultant for that identified areas that they recommended for enhancements and expansion and new park and ride lots. So coming back to the high capacity transit work, we will definitely be matching up those two things and definitely considering park and ride at stations and other areas that make sense to support the high capacity transit system. And Bob, did you have anything on the other two questions? Or should I tackle those?
Let's say again, I didn't catch that last.
Did you have anything on the other two questions, or should I talk about those?
Why don't you go ahead?
Okay. So for the next steps question, what's Compass doing with the study? We will be starting with some of those items that Bob talked about in the presentation, some of the recommendations from AECOM. So working with the federal agencies, looking at the thresholds for when we need to get different pieces in place for the high capacity transit, and really fleshing out the options more. And of course, a big next step was the high capacity transit survey, which Amy mentioned is open now. We want to hear from the public about what people in the region want from a high capacity transit and where it would make sense to put it, which features are important. So that will help us to narrow down those options that Bob talked about today and get community feedback to make sure that we're going in the right direction. And then there will be a lot of different things to do in the future as we refine the options. There's, as Bob mentioned, various federal processes, figuring out the land that we need to acquire and the right of way, improving our cost estimates that was talked about a lot today. We'll improve those so we have a better idea of what we need in terms of funding, and then finding that funding. We'll need to have a dedicated funding source to make this work. And so just working towards that and improving our local bus system, working with Valley Regional Transit to build the supporting bus network that we need to have in place for the high capacity transit. And then the third question was about Ontario and Mountain Home. Those were not considered as part of this study, but they certainly might be future expansions of the system. I frequently hear questions about those two areas. So those might be areas that we want to expand to in the future, depending on the demand and where growth is occurring. So it's definitely not out of the question.
And Rachel, I'm going to ask you to stay on for one more question. You mentioned the current bus system, Valley Regional Transit bus system, and I am just scrolling to find that question. If you can address just that the current bus system does not get a lot of ridership, and how does that really relate to the study that we're working on now? And have you looked at that in the broader context?
Sure. So yes, the bus system today, it has, it's difficult to fund it given the situation in this region. And that's a big part of why ridership isn't as high as it could be, because when the funding is limited, Valley Regional Transit is limited in what they can do with their routes in terms of the frequency and the spread in the region and the operating hours. Those are things I'm always hearing that people want more, and that takes more funding, and our funding is limited here. So as we continue to plan for the future, Valley Regional Transit is making improvements to their services all the time. They just made some improvements back in October, and they're always looking at how they can better serve the region. And we're seeing growing ridership with those changes. And as we continue to plan for the future, expanding the service and working towards, at Compass, we're planning for the year 2050. So what system will we need in place? And as we improve, we're seeing more ridership, and we can build towards these high capacity transit services in the longer term.
And actually, Rachel, one more question for you. As the Treasure Valley grows, especially growing further south, Kuna area, South Boise, how or if will that affect the plans that you are working on now?
Yeah, that will be similar to the question about Ontario and Mountain Home. There is certainly growth happening throughout the region and in different areas. I'm sure we'll see changes that we didn't expect as we look to the next 30 years. So we will certainly be watching that growth and determining where changes to the high capacity transit route need to happen, or where future routes need to serve, and then also just Valley Regional Transit's local bus system, where they will be looking at the same things and adjusting their own system to serve those new areas of growth.
And then back to you, Bob. Can you talk about the population densities needed for those different modes, and how in your study did you find that the Treasure Valley lines up with those needed population densities?
We did look at population and employment density in the vicinity of each one of the alignments, and I don't have that at my fingertips, but it is an important consideration. That's part of the equation. That is, what's the current population and how does it relate to the alignment? The other important one, and probably the more important one, is what's the projections? And the projections continue to be a very, very high level of population growth in this general corridor, and pretty large numbers. And my understanding is that's already well underway, that the last 10 years, the growth has been over 20, I can't remember the number right now, but I think it's over 25% in a 10-year period. But the other aspect of it is part of an investment in a system like this is to serve future development and provide some structure to that can be better served by public services. And so where you locate stations isn't always in the midst of the current development. It may be where the community and the planning process has said there's going to be a high density area, and it's planned around around a station area. A lot of that is happening throughout the country, and you see a lot of that in the Portland and Seattle regions where they've invested in rail, and a portion of those systems are serving existing well-populated areas, but a good portion, every one of those lines also is serving areas where growth is anticipated, and they expect to have the higher density growth to happen in this areas of stations, so it'd be more attractive to future users, and it will be more economical for the transit system to serve those if the dense development occurs around the station. So it's a bit of each, like I said, most new investments are kind of have their eye on both of those. Yes, they want to have the short-term ridership because that's what the public's going to look at and see whether whether this investment's being used, but also it's a mechanism to help shape the future growth and have it more efficiently served.
So the next question, as I'm sure you know, Bob, HOV lanes are not allowed in Idaho except for in certain resort areas. And so currently they're not allowed on Interstate 84 or here in the Treasure Valley. Yes. If that were to change, do you have a sense of how that might change your study results? Would that impact travel times? Would that impact ridership? Or was that already assumed as part of the study?
It wasn't assumed as part of the study. That part's clear, probably a higher level of detail than what we're operating at right now with this really high level look at alternatives. But and HOV lanes, they serve a function, one of which is to make a lot of people mad because people don't have a buddy riding in their car, can't use them. But they are an effective method of kind of speeding up those that choose to have multiple people in a car, and that in terms of the overall throughput of say a 6-lane freeway, 3 in each direction, you got HOV lanes in the center, 2 lanes, 1 in each direction. Most of the studies show that the overall throughput of person trips can be increased if it's done right. So but on the other end, then the secondary question is, does that become in some form or fashion kind of a BRT mix kind of operation? Do you allow buses in that lane? And most operations, at least here in Oregon and Southwest Washington, they do. To the degree there's a HOV lane, public transit buses are allowed to use it. Now, they may not use it because they have stops to make and they can't get in and out of the HOV lane. But that has a lot more to do with the through person trips through an area than it does the transit side. I don't know if I answered that question.
And then
Sorry. Go ahead.
next question actually also deals with exclusive bus lanes or HOV lanes, or using the Union Pacific rail corridor, all of which are essentially off limits at this point. The Union Pacific owns its own rail corridor, and the HOV lanes would require state legislation to change. Conversation, or the question really is probably more of a Rachel question, or I believe my colleague Lisa Itkinen is on as well, and I may punt to her as well, of what types of conversations have there been around either of those, and do either of you see that as being something likely to change?
Yeah, I can start on that. So yes, there have been conversations with Union Pacific in the past in regards to having high capacity transit, sharing their right of way for the Boise cutoff, and also conversations about putting in a trail there for a rail with trail project. And I was not there for these, but at that time, Union Pacific was not very interested in having that at that time. So we do continue to plan for it as an option within the various alternatives that Bob talked about today, so that as we develop better cost estimates and planning and designs, we can go to Union Pacific again and discuss further how that might work and what they would need to allow it. And I would be interested to hear from Bob about if you have any advice or knowledge to share about working with Class 1 railroads.
Yeah, I have a lot of experience with that, and it's always a tough negotiation, and I've never been in one, I've been in a lot of them, where it starts out by them embracing you at the first meeting. That doesn't happen. But they're open to discussion, and it really depends on their view of the future of that railroad. And as an example, the commuter rail line, which is about a 18-mile line, 15-mile line here in Portland on the west side of the region. I was a project manager for that, and we started out, we had to deal with both Union Pacific and BNSF because the line in the middle switched from one ownership to the other. And you know, at first they were not open to it, but the line is not a high volume line. And so eventually the discussion was, well, how do we make this work for both of us? And the negotiations took a lot of different twists and turns, but the final analysis, we were able to negotiate having a commuter rail operation. And in return, they got upgraded tracks because you have to update the freight tracks, particularly on a non-mainline track, which is the case with the Boise cutoff. So we had to upgrade a lot of the structures and the trackage itself and the signal system and the protection system. And so they benefited from all that. Plus you built additional sidings so that trains could pass each other. The passenger trains, well, they got to use it. That was to their advantage. In the final analysis, they also ended up being the operator of the system. In that case, because they were still running freight, we needed them to handle the dispatching. And so it made sense for them to also operate the train. So, so the trains are owned by the public, and the public provided the maintenance facility for the trains and do the train maintenance, but the operation itself is run by the short line operator. So every one of these projects have a different series of twists and turns. But like I said, I've never been involved in one where the answer in the first day you knock on their door is they embrace you and say, great idea. Never had that happen. So it's a negotiation. And if they see advantages from that negotiation from a financial standpoint or from a standpoint of some of the obligations they have in terms of maintenance of their facilities that get taken care of by a public investment, then there may be that could change. So it's a straight up, it's a negotiation. But at this point, given the status of that line, the Boise cutoff, that's why I distinguish in some of my earlier comments is whole different matter when you're dealing with the main line than a line like the Boise cutoff, which is a low volume line in terms of freight movement.
So next question actually kind of moves away from transit, but looking at the broader transportation system and how things might fit in together, is about if the Idaho Transportation Department has any new highways in the works. And I'm going to ask Lisa Itkinen from our staff, from the Compass staff, to address that quickly. Oh, shoot, sorry. Nope, you are muted because you are not a co-host. Let me find you. Sorry about that.
Interesting background, Lisa.
Thank you. So yes, Idaho Transportation Department is looking at extending State Highway 16 from US 2026 Ochinden to Interstate 84. So that would be a new highway when it's getting built. So it's they're currently working on the design for that, and it's going to be a while.
Thank you, Lisa. And it is 3:27, and also that was, I believe, the last question that we had in the queue. So thank you again, Bob, for sharing your study, your results, your insights. Thank you to all of you who were able to stay on the line the extra 30 minutes and dive deeper into some of the questions that you all had. Just a reminder, if you have not already, to please complete the Compass survey, all aboard, to explore different high capacity transit options in the Treasure Valley, to get an idea of what you want, what type of options appeal to you, or if no options appeal to you, if you would prefer us not to see or prefer us not to pursue high capacity transit. We want to hear that as well. So thank you all again. I appreciate everyone's attention and some great questions and conversation. And I wish you all a great rest of your afternoon. Thank you all so much.